Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about what I'm calling the neuropsychology of goal setting. I just finished two books, one called The Working Brain and the second book called Higher Cortical Functions in Man by both by Alexander Luria, a Soviet neuropsychologist. And I just want to share some of the facts about the brain that I learned and how different aspects of our brain relate to psychological functioning, one of them being goal setting. I want to focus in on the part of the brain that has to deal with goal setting and then try to relate some of those neurological facts to goal setting in marathon training, something I've experienced personally, as well as goal setting in an organizational setting. So, Luria divides the brain into three functional units. And the first unit has to deal with how awake or how alert we are. He uses the term cortical tone. And that brain unit consists of the base part of the brain, primarily the brainstem. And then the second functional unit has to deal with our senses, and it primarily consists of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobe, and that's really the back half of the neocortex. And then we have the third functional unit, which is the motor unit, and that's the front half of the cortex, and that has to deal with our capacity to plan and set goals and regulate our behaviors, and it also has much to do with our voluntary coordination of movement. Now, Luria is careful to state that prior to the 20th century, there were at least two competing theories about how our brain relates to our psychological functions. And you could view these theories as two extremes along a spectrum. And one theory said that all psychological, perhaps all human functions can be pinpointed or found or localized somewhere in a specific area in the brain, perhaps down to the specificity of a neuron. And so things like humor or will or charisma could be in separate neurons throughout the brain. And then you have a theory that's on the other side of this spectrum, which says that the entire brain is active and involved in every single function in a indivisible way that has a gestalt-like function. So you have two theories that are relatively disparate. Well, in the 20th century, at least this is from the perspective of Luria and the Soviet psychologists that he worked with and studied under, they chose to have a theory. It's a better way to phrase that. The empirical data of their research led them to infer a theory that's more in the middle route. And so these three functional units that I listed, not completely exhaustive of everything in the brain, but they are all coordinated, interconnected, but independent networks that lead to the functioning of our psychological behavior. And so reading, for example, well, you have to be awake, so that's the first unit. You have to use your vision. You're also transferring what you're seeing into phonemes or words in your mind, and so that's two senses right there, but again, that's still the second unit. And then you also have to have the intent to read, as well as regulating your eye movements and correcting your reading, and so that's the frontal part. So with something as simple that we do quite frequently, such as reading, you could see how different parts of the brain are all involved in this one functional unit or one behavior, but they contribute different dynamics to how we go about completing the process of reading, for example. And so that's kind of just a rough overview of how Luria breaks down the brain, and also how he understands how the brain relates to our psychological functioning. Now, again, as I mentioned, the frontal lobe, the third unit, which consists of the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, and the motor strip, one of the primary functions of that third functional unit is goal setting. And what's been interesting to read these books about neuropsychology, I didn't really understand the difference between just psychology and neuropsychology until I read these books. And from Luria's perspective, the goal of neuropsychology is to understand the different symptoms and pathologies that that patients may have, to try to understand what damage has been done to the brain. And once you can understand the pathological damage to the brain and how that inhibits or facilitates certain behaviors, then you can draw various conclusions and inferences about how the different brain systems enable different higher cortical functions. And so when you see someone who has frontal lobe damage, and you observe their changes in behavior, you can get an understanding of what the frontal lobe in humans does for us. And so, diving deeper into the frontal lobe, again, primary functions are goal setting, the regulation of movements, and then the checking or correcting and assessing the outcome of different movements that we do. And so I think an example would help me clarify this. So a common neuropsychological test that clinicians will offer is that they'll have their patients look at an image, and the image will be colored and be two-dimensional, and they would have their patients use different blocks that have different colors and different faces. They would have them replicate that image. And so that involves spatial analysis. It involves maintaining the image in your mind as you're manipulating the blocks to try to recreate the image. And it's a complicated behavior that requires many different parts of the brain. And so it doesn't necessarily matter if the patient can solve the problem correctly. What the clinician cares about is how they fail, the nature of their difficulty when they're trying to solve the problem. And so a normal patient will, like I said, just look at the picture. They'll create an initial plan about how they would go about solving that problem. They would analyze each block, and they would maybe categorize them like, okay, these ones are red, these ones are yellow, these ones have two sides that are yellow, etc. And they would then form a hypothesis, essentially, which is their initial movement to try to create the picture. And then they would look at the picture, look at what they created, and measure the distance and see, is it correct or is it incorrect? And then they would make adjustments and solve the problem. Now, patients with frontal lobe damage, they'll be impulsive, and they also won't be able to, they're unable to understand if they're correct or not. And so instead of sitting there looking at the image and then making a plan for how to manipulate the blocks, they'll just quickly put some blocks together, and then they'll look at the clinician and say, I'm done. And they will have no idea that there's a mismatch there. And it's interesting to differentiate this type of disturbance with a patient who has disturbance in their second motor unit, their second functional unit, the sensory unit. And so these patients will be able to look at the picture, look at their blocks, and they'll be able to formulate a plan. They'll be able to see if they're correct or not. And they'll be able to make adjustments, but where they struggle, specifically if they have a disturbance in their parietal occipital lobe, so the visual spatial part of the brain, I hope I'm getting that right, they'll know that they are having difficulties, specifically if that part of the brain that's damaged is in their left hemisphere. They'll know that their behavior is incorrect, but they will just have some sort of block. And so that's a very different way of failing that test compared to someone who impulsively just reacts quickly, doesn't make a plan, and also is unaware of how the degree to which they made an error. So again, many more examples like that, but what was really interesting to me is just the how two things. One, the methods that were used to understand where goal setting and behavioral regulation and inhibition of irrelevant behaviors, what was in the brain, more or less. And then the second thing that was interesting is just the fact that, our biology developed to allow us to have these different processes so that way we can make our way in the world. And so we set goals, and when we set a goal, we inhibit behaviors that are irrelevant to that goal. And when we go out and attempt to achieve that goal, we then reassess, okay, what was the outcome that we did, and does that outcome match our desires and our expectations? So that's just very interesting to me. Okay, so talked about frontal lobes. One way to abstract this, one point that we can take from this is the importance of the frontal lobes, and so don't damage your brain, obviously. But another point that we could take from this is the importance of goal setting. And so you don't have to have brain damage to suffer the consequences of not setting a clear goal or not setting a goal at all. And so let's recap. People who are unable to set goals, they're impulsive, and they are unable to assess their behaviors to know if they're right or wrong. Well, why are they impulsive? So the way the brain developed, from the third functional unit to the second to the first, phylogenetically and ontogenetically, when we have damage in those frontal lobes, well, one of the things that our frontal lobe does is inhibit many of those older brain systems. And so if the frontal lobe is damaged and we don't have a goal, well, then we resort to our impulsive habits, or what Luria calls our stereotypical behaviors. And what's interesting about patients with frontal lobe lesions is that if you put a cup in front of them, they just grab it and they start drinking. Or if they walk past the doorway, they just walk through it. Or if they're in bed rest in a nursing home, they will just continually press the button to call the nurse, and they don't exactly know why they do it. And that's because there's no goal that unifies all of their behaviors. And so when they're processing information in the world, they are seeing things to do, and they're seeing objects to grab, objects to manipulate, things to avoid. And a lot of that is habitual and automated. And without that frontal lobe, without that goal that integrates all of those behaviors, they are left to be impulsive and just do, random things. There's also patients who do the opposite, where they don't do anything. And it's a very similar reason. Without a goal, you don't have a direction and you don't have an aim. And so, there's why would you do anything, I guess, is a question if you don't have a goal and if you don't have anything that you're aiming at. And there's obviously different types of goals. There are, goals that are super intellectualized and abstract, and then there's simple goals as far as just, well, I need to eat right now. All of those are still goals, and you can see in patients with frontal lobe lesions that they can either be very impulsive and they resort to habitual behaviors, or they don't do anything. Now, the second part, they don't know how to. If you don't have a goal, it's very difficult to know which way is up. It's very difficult to know which behaviors or habits are good. And so without a goal, there's no valence on your day-to-day activities. And again, we see this with patients with frontal lobe lesions. They don't have the ability to assess the correctness or validity of their solutions or hypothesis for solving a solution. If you give them a math problem, if you ask them to, read a paragraph, a short story, and give them the gist of the story, or like my example earlier with the blocks, if you don't have a goal, you don't know what's good and what's bad. You don't know what's right and what's wrong, because, by definition, for something to be right, it has to be in pursuit of something. It has to be under a given context. And so, to me, again, you don't have to have frontal lobe damage to not have a goal. And so when we're going through life, personally for me, as I'm going through marathon training, I currently don't have a marathon scheduled. And so in a sense, I don't have a goal. And I can see myself, the motivation is not there to the same degree as it was when I did have a goal in mind, a time that I'm trying to hit, and a race scheduled on the calendar. And so I still have higher and lower order goals, right? My ultimate goal is to reduce the most amount of unnecessary suffering for the most amount of people, and that means that part of that means that I need to be healthy, and part of that means that I need to, be aerobic and anaerobically fit, and so I need to run, and so I can, even though I don't have a marathon race scheduled, I can shift to a higher order goal and like, oh, okay, that's my motivation. That's why I need to go out and run today. And I can also shift to a lower order goal and just say, look, my goal today is to run these 10 miles and hit this time or just get the mileage done. But I do notice that there's there's this notion in cognitive linguistics called prototype. What is it called? Ideals or prototype dynamics. Basically, it was posited. I read it in this book, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things by George Lakoff. And there's this idea that, well, when you think of numbers, let's think of the category of numbers. I'm going to tie this back in, I swear. When you think of the category of numbers, there are some numbers that are more numbery, for lack of better terms. There are more numbers that represent that category of numbers than others. And so, when you think of a number, let's say like 7, right? We could probably ask 1,000 people to think of a number, and it's going to be, it's probably going to be a single or double-digit integer. Okay, even though we have imaginary numbers, we have negative numbers, we have decimal points, all different kinds of numbers, but most people are probably going to think of, when they think of the category of number, they're going to think of the instance of an integer. Let's just say that. So in that case, an integer is a ideal component or ideal concept within the category of numbers. And you can do the same thing with colors. There are some reds that are more reddy than other reds, or more blues that are more bluish, that represent the ideal blue than other blues. Same thing with emotions. You can go on for many other examples. So this idea of let's just call it prototype theory, I wonder if that is blended with this notion of goals, where for me, when it comes to marathon training, again, I have my higher order goals of wanting to be healthy, and then I have my lower order goals of, well, I need to get this run done today. But there's something about, for me personally, having that prototype goal, ideal goal perhaps, where it's optimally motivating to me when I have a marathon 12 weeks out, where I have a time that I know I can reasonably hit. And there's something about that makes things so much easier when I'm getting up in the morning and I don't want to go for the run, or I need to push a little bit harder to hit these times and I just don't want to do it because, well, I'm still going to be healthy. Even if I don't get these, if I'm doing a 1,000-meter repeats and I need to do it in under 3 minutes, or, well, I need to do it in under 3 minutes and 50 seconds. Oh, so what? I did it in 3 minutes and 52 seconds. Oh, so what? I did it in 3 minutes and 58 seconds. I'm still going to be fit, and I still got my run done for the day. But there's something about how every second matters when it comes to that hyper clear goal of a specific time in 12 weeks where I'm running this distance. So, interesting side tangent. But yeah, it's important to set goals. We see this in organizations as well. I think what we see on the psychological side and the consequences of not setting a goal can also be illustrated in different organizations. And I think back to my time in the Marine Corps, my time in corporate America. Whenever my teams or my department, my larger organization, anywhere from 40 to 1,000 people, if the goal wasn't clear, what happened? Well, people didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. So they didn't know what was right and what was wrong. And people just resorted to what they usually did. Certain battle rhythm events that, well, I know this has to get done, and I know this email over here needs to get sent. That would be called the whirlwind from, what's his name? Sean Covey, 4 Disciplines of Execution. He says that there's, in any workplace environment, there's 80% of the work that's the whirlwind, that's stuff that kind of needs to get done, but it's not really adding value. And then there's 20% of things that we need to fight to get to, because those are the real money makers. But if there's not a clear goal, you don't exactly know what your clear money makers are and what that 20% is, and so you resort back to your that 80% of just the whirlwind, and yeah, maybe you're sustaining, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're making progress. And so I just found it very interesting to understand, to try to get a better idea of the importance of goal setting, and to actually see the physiological manifestation, or the psychophysio-pathological, I just made up a word, what happens when people have actual brain damage and they can't set goals. And to a lesser degree, we perhaps can see that in our own lives from just a psychological perspective, when we don't set a clear goal. Maybe we're anxious, we're confused, we're impulsive, we fall back on habits, whether they're good or bad habits, and we just don't have a clear aim. And so I would just leave you all with, if you find yourself, or if you see other people who perhaps are anxious or confused, or you think they're in a rut, or if you're in a rut, maybe you can ask yourself if one, you have a goal, or two, if your goal is optimal, if it's a prototype or ideal goal, like that theory I mentioned earlier. All right, I'm gonna end it there. Thank you guys for listening.